Good morning, everyone. It is Mike, Tommy, and Seth with the Explicit Measures Podcast. How's everyone doing? Good morning. Tommy learned this morning about traffic and roads.
The first time. So slightly late. We're much better than last
Much better than last
episode.
time.
Yeah,
Well,
we're not 15 minutes late.
Helps when you actually have the internet.
It's a big help. We had a few new people on last time too, and then we're like, hold on, no, it's really good. No, I think,
please go watch the earlier episodes where we're much better.
yeah. Thanks, Melissa, Coach, for taking the time. Sorry, just wait. Can you wait another 10?
Yeah, right. A bunch of people showing up.
Yeah,
it's hilarious. You can blame that on me, but at least I had technical problems instead of planning problems.
Yeah, there we go.
Just saying.
Kind of out of your control.
I saw the user group on Tuesday. You guys have been rolling out user group meetings like crazy. We got a machine there for user groups.
We're helping out a lot of other user groups. So we did the one on Monday. That's our Power Apps Milwaukee Power BI Power Platform user group. So we did Monday's one during the day, and then we did Tuesday in the evening. That was our group, which was fun. A lot of fun, by the way. There was actually a lot of. It's been turning into this interesting, like, we do the session, and then we kind of have happy hour afterwards. You know, kind of not online. It's not broadcasted through YouTube. And we kind of just hang out, just talk about things. There's a couple of people who regularly show up, and then they've been turning into these like mini hackathons. So the last 2 times we've done it, we've been like, has anybody found any interesting code or anything across the web that's kind of interesting? Let's play around with something. Who wants to learn something? And so we've kind of been sharing screens and building things and playing around with stuff, which has been a lot of fun. And so, yeah, there might be some YouTubes coming out of what we learned about in the evening of the
Who knows? We may have some presentations from people coming out of it too. You know,
that's true.
You never know.
Yes,
but I agree that rather than just asking questions of the presenter and stuff, I like where it's starting to go, which is you got a bunch of people that enjoy working with Power BI and kicking the tires on an idea or a new tool or something like that, and it was fun. It was a great time.
So that was, and then we have Tommy. You got one coming up on the 9th. So that's the 9th of November for the user group for Chicago. So we're gonna help out with that one. And I just got my fingers involved with working out with the. I don't remember exactly the location of it. But James Bartlett has resurrected the Des Moines user group. So the Des Moines user group's coming out, and then they're going to be on, I believe, on Friday next week. So they're also like, hey, can you guys just blast it across all the social medias? Like, yeah, sure, why not?
Mike's like, put my face on camera again.
Oh, I don't. I don't. So I don't put my face on camera on the other ones.
Cranking out a lot.
Yeah.
Congrats, man. It's good stuff.
Little by little, I think there's a lot of.
Whenever I miss you, I just turn on a YouTube video.
And
I just open YouTube,
and it reminds me how much
I know recommendations.
The creepiest, I will say this: the creepiest was taking a break. These YouTube shorts on your phone.
Yeah.
The creepiest was where Mike popped up on my YouTube shorts when you did a few when you went over to Europe. I was like, "Whoa, all right, that's enough."
That's a bit too much. It's a bit too much.
The next day, you're just gonna see ads by Mike on Google.
Exactly.
It was a hilarious story, though. Like, hey, I'm going to presentation in Europe, and I forgot my laptop.
Yeah, that was a good one. I felt that was worthy of. I was trying out the shorts thing. I didn't know how. I don't know how it really works very well. Everyone else is good at making these like roundabout loops, like. Their ending phrase is the beginning phrase, so you can just kind of keep watching it twice. And you're like, I don't really know where it starts and where it ends because their ending question begins their starting phrase, and they're getting pretty smart with all this stuff. So
it's another generation, Mike.
Oh man,
we passed that time.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, probably. So today's topic. Let's jump in. Actually, before I do that, any other kind of announcement across the blog, any new developments that you saw? That would be worth talking about before we get going? I'll take that as a no.
I think we're good.
I'll take that as a no. All right. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about, working in Power BI. What is a short-term? What is a long-term solution? And, fight. This is going to be one, how we kind of work through what defines a short-term versus long-term solution in Power BI. Why you may come to one design plan versus another. What will be the reasoning for doing a short lived report as opposed to trying to always build everything to live a long time, have a long longevity. So yeah, we'll go there. Tommy, I believe this whose topic was this? Was this your topic, Tommy?
And I think it was we were at the summit or somewhere where we were together where someone was talking about short term, long term, and that's why I wrote it down. I wish I wrote down the actual source, but the idea here is really anytime we're building reports, there's always that conflict of the resources available, time, people, data, and the client involved. And you never have unlimited resources with each of these.
Yes.
And the difference here, we've talked about like technical debt before, we've talked about other things when project planning, but the idea here is you're very limited resources, or you only have a finite set. And not only that, but you're dealing with a stakeholder, a client, a requester who's expecting, project A to turn out in a certain way. But sometimes based on getting something out, there may be something that can be satisfied in the near term, or you can take the time and really plan something out. And again, this is, I think, all things data, and especially when we're dealing with Power BI, where there are more connectors that we need. So the idea here is really like, where do you start when you getting a request? Where's that planning? Where's that compromise? So I'll leave the floor right there, and just want to hear from you guys, just common scenarios that you've heard, or actually kind of start with, let's define short and long.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's start from your beginning. Let's just kind of say, when we talk about a Power BI report that's going to have a short-term solution versus a long-term solution, let's just define what we think those mean first. So maybe kick it over to Seth. How would you define short versus long-term, Seth?
I'll start with this, right? A short-term report should be one that's like ad hoc. It's a one-time analysis. You're using Power BI to compile a bunch of data and produce some insights for a one-time thing, or sporadically for yourself. Long-term, it's going to be around a while, or it serves a business purpose, or something that's not going to go away. People are going to reference it a lot. That's the simplistic where I think we're going, or probably going with the conversation. Yep. Is the what we talked about in an earlier podcast, where part of that upfront conversation should have the question of how long, or like how many people, or like what the duration of the report is going to be. Is it a one-time thing? Is it a, to kind of suss out what sort of shortcuts really you can take, or things you don't have to do in the report. I think where this is an interesting conversation is most reports could be both, right? Is there a short-term implementation and a long-term? And that dovetails into another episode, which is around tech debt, right? How much are you going to incur to get something out the door as quickly as possible? Because let's face it, any business you're in, they want things as fast as possible. And it's our job Agreed. To, if we had all the time in the world, of course we could do a magnificent job in producing every single report. And it would probably, add 30% more time onto everything you do.
Maybe more, right? Yeah.
And some firms you can do that.
Yep.
In most organizations I've ever been a part of, you can't. So this is an interesting conversation, because like, what are the things you have to make part of your short term versus something that you can move into a long term. I think
you bring up some interesting thoughts here, and it triggers some other ideas in my head. First one was, you talked a little bit about short term, long term, and you talked about the size of the audience. So I think that's maybe an aspect that we look at here, right? A short term report would be expected to be viewed or used by a smaller subset of people, right? It's more like about what I'm doing, what I'm working on, not necessarily being shared. I think the long-term version of a report is more about a larger audience. So I think that's one, the delineation there. And there's another part of this. Oh, the other thought you mentioned there towards the end, Seth, I'm thinking like, short-term could be more of that self-service piece, right? It's kind of an ungoverned, I built it, I made it, it's up and working, it does what I need it to do. Long-term living or long-term designed reports are more around that report that you're going to it's going higher in the organization. It's at the C levels, VP levels. These are people that are going to rely on this report day after day. So again, it's kind of like your audience, and then it's now a matter of like, okay, how much governing is on top of that report, right? Because you're going to spend, again, with Tommy's point, we have a finite amount of time and money. So if we had a lot of time and money, we'd throw 10 developers on a report and just let them go to town, figure the whole thing out. We don't have that luxury, nor do we have unlimited time. So we have to kind of figure things out and evaluate, what do these reports do, and are they supposed to sit in short term and long term? So how do you like those definitions, Tommy, or do you want to add to those?
I'm actually going to disagree with kind of what you guys. Yes, it's been a while. So the idea, because I was trying to think about this, and again, one of our previous episodes we talked about technical debt.
Sure.
Again, a lot of things like, okay, how is this different? So I don't think short-term solution is necessarily just for either an ad hoc self-service or for just a preliminary report. To me, the short-term is not necessarily that you don't, whether it's like we don't have the data, we'd have to wait longer. It's, can we come out, deliver something that has the bells and whistles that are the bare minimum? You could obviously create a more advanced report with more bookmarks, more features, do a little more performance optimization. That's part of the technical debt. But the short term is more like, can we just give a bare bones and that serves the purpose?
Well, you're talking about development cycle. What I would argue there is, even though your report is bare bones, that could serve a long-term purpose.
Yes, but I'm saying the short term at the time, just to get it out the door, because you're done really with the solution when the person requesting it, in a sense, is satisfied.
And they leave you alone.
And when they leave you alone. So, but more or less.
Your report usage is 0? Or
yeah. Well, I mean,
okay.
Well, yeah, no, but I mean, listen, I could put one table on a visual and make that my entire report, and I will get views. I will get usage out of it.
So your definition for long term is what you get out the door first. So let's assume it's a report that's going to be around a while. What you get out the door first versus enhancements.
Right. Basically, like having your basic.
Fits into the second part.
Sure, it fits in the second part, but I think that you may need to take more time, because there's other difficulties too, where maybe you're asking for a report, you don't have the connections. You have to build some custom APIs. There's other connections that you need authorization. You have to go through the data. I don't think that's necessarily part of just the short term, but there's that conversation of what is the bare minimum that we need to at least satisfy to get this out so we can push it live.
So really what we're talking about is like the versions of a report.
Yeah. I mean,
call it version, call it whatever the case.
We call it a version.
Minimum viable product.
MVP.
Yeah. And then we can kind of recycle, so to speak, or revisit at another time.
So and that's cool, right? I guess for clarity.
You don't have to agree with me, but
I don't think we're disagreeing.
Okay.
I think you're further defining the third thing we were talking about. Which was exactly this short putting something out there versus that longer term lead. So I guess I have like 4 different things right off the top of my head, but what are some of the significant differences between a short term version of a report and a long term?
I'm going to talk very tactically what I think would be just physical items, like the actual styling piece of it, right? A few, if not no bookmarks, no background images, right? You're talking, maybe you change the background color to like a gray and drop visuals on the page. That's probably about it for me. Like if I'm talking like a quick report, getting something out there, and I'm thinking of like, this is like the idea of, and again, I keep going back to like audience, right? Those kind of reports, I'm not going to present to a wider audience. Those kind of reports, I'm going to use internal to a small team. It's like monitoring our pipeline. We want to see our data moving through our enterprise data warehouse system, right? And we want to just track what's going on. It doesn't need to be pretty. It just needs to show numbers by day. It's a short-term solution. You do, it's a very short development cycle. Put some data down, shape it, done, move on. When you start talking like longer-term solutions, you're doing like, now I'm adding backgrounds. Now I'm adding bookmarks. I'm working with the marketing team or whatever to refine this, external-facing report. The people consuming the data require there's more rigor around the numbers are correct, right? We just can't throw numbers down from a table. We actually have to go back through and evaluate them, make more elaborate calculations. So that's kind of where I think the breakpoints are.
I mean, what about you?
See, I think the things that you just described, like the background, some of the colors, that should be for any solution if you have a theme.
No.
Yeah.
There are
okay.
solutions. There are solutions that do not need this.
I'll disagree.
Internal reporting for the BI team does not need a theme or background. They would not.
I feared I may divert, but I will just say, create a theme for your internal team.
This is Shakespearean
Upload that,
almost?
you're done. So, and then that solves that problem all of a sudden. You never have to worry about that again if you have a theme per one. What I would say, especially whether, again, you could be dealing with short term, doesn't have to be like 5 days. Short term could be 3 weeks, depending on the project scope.
Oh, dude, if anything falls into 3 weeks of scope, that's for me instantly long term. Short term is like a couple days development max.
I think we're talking about bigger things though, because it doesn't necessarily have to be, hey, we already have.
I want to work in your organization.
Yeah, I want to build 3 weeks for a report.
Well done, Tommy. If you
Right.
if your estimates of things are 3 weeks long, you get a golf clap, man.
Let's all listen here and understand what we're saying when we say short term versus long term.
Yeah.
Because again, you may be dealing with something from the ground up, a new infrastructure. It may have to be integrated with another product. You may be dealing with a Power App where there has to be more data input and data validation. That doesn't necessarily mean 5 days. I think when we're thinking the very standard solution is, hey, build a report. We already have the data. We just have to do some modifications. That's not necessarily always the case. There's, again, something new introduced, a new data source, a new logic, or there's going to be external things that are going to be affecting the report. Short term to me is the bare minimum to get out the door, that it can be published, that it can start being used by an audience. And again, depending, it could be something that you already have the data available where it can be turned in 3 days, or it could be something where, again, there's a huge infrastructure take that may take a longer time, but it's still, to me, it's the short term compared to what the end solution is.
I think we're saying the same thing. I think we're just saying it slightly different, right? So you're saying you're saying
that happens a lot.
Well, I mean, I think we're kind of defining a lot of the similar items, right? You're saying short term could take a little bit of time to develop it, but when you start getting into these a longer term development cycle takes more effort around getting the
when you have other people involved, you have other people's dependencies, not just you.
You start talking about the more integrations, like with Power Apps, getting extra data sources. I mean, 100% we agree that it's long term, and I think I feel like what I'm hearing is, I'm just saying when I'm defining short term, and I think this is maybe the only difference where I'm hearing you talk differently than what I am, is when I'm saying short term, I'm literally saying like the time to develop the report is a short term thing, and I would almost probably put, as and maybe not a best practice, but maybe like a word to the wise. Most of your report things, assuming that there's not a large requirements gathering at the very beginning, right? That someone comes in and says, hey, we just want this you kind of start off most reports in this short-term space. Most reports kind of begin there because you want to get something in front of people to get them to react to it. Because I feel like most of the time when I'm building reports, people don't know what they want until they've seen it. So when I spend a lot of time trying to interpret what people are looking for, even if I've done a good requirements gathering on it, it doesn't always seem to meet their needs. And I've gone through a number of cycles with reporting where I build one, we have meetings with them, here's what we're building. Like, oh yeah, this is great. The person who's leading the building the report space, we go give this report to people, and they're like, that wasn't really what I wanted. And so we go through a couple iterations on it. So I feel like, I don't think we're saying different things. I think we're saying the same stuff. I just feel like when I'm talking about short-term items, I'm literally talking about time to development. If it's a short-term development solution, we're taking a little amount of time to develop it, and we're paring out or removing a lot of this extra stuff that would take away my time from developing that report quickly.
So I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, right?
Okay.
Because I think some of the challenge around short-term, long-term is where either you're doing a first version of a report is going to be around, or like the chat's discussing right now.
Yep.
The short term that turns into the long term, right? You put out a report that you don't know where it might land, but it's going to stick around because usage, Mike, like you said.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge for me and the distinction between these two when you're building something to produce value to the business is is the impact of the decisions you make around short versus long term.
Yeah.
Because make no mistake, right? The first thing everybody needs to understand is you are the owner of the decisions of what goes in one versus two. And there's a business assumption that what you are building is going to work as expected. So, what are the sacrifices you're making in choosing a short, like to get something out quicker versus the long term solution? And I think in my mind, they revolve around a couple categories. One is you're potentially creating issues with scalability, right? You're implementing things in your model that are expansive in size, but it's fine because your first revs are not going to hit loads that you're you could assume over time. So you're building in something that you could tweak out later. Reliability, right? Like how fast or like is the pipeline you built solid is all get, or is there a backup strategy? Is there restoring that model? Have you done all of the pieces in place that make sure that you're going to have timely data? Performance, are you some of those same things in terms of like the scalability thing? Is your model going to be performant? Could you tweak it more? Right. Yeah, you could spend another day performance tuning, sure, and get another second out of it. Does that matter? Well, maybe not up front. And then I think you go into other areas where that are visual, right? Usage, like end user usage of the report. When they're clicking on certain things, do we have the information icon? Do you have a hover over? Do you have something that like is intuitive from the end user perspective because everybody's going to be using it, or it's an external facing application kind of report? And is it visually appealing? Like those are the five things that like in my mind are the trade-offs that I start to make when I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, we could make this a 3-week project, or we could make it a 1-week project, but I think the challenge for me is you can't assume that you're not going to need to address those, because if you put something out that is sacrificing in one of those areas, and eventually you're going to hit a threshold, you're building that pool of tech debt that you absolutely need to like address at some point down in the future.
So I love where this is going, because I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I think especially you start following this rut of doing a lot more short term, where all of a sudden most of your reports out there are this bare minimum product. But I think there's risks on both sides, and
I would
think
agree
too, because sometimes we're like, okay, if I had all this time, I could build the perfect report. That's not always the case, because I think there's a lot of times too where that deadline, or just to get something out the door, again, all of us can be very analytical, and all of us can maybe enhance a report too much. We're all of a sudden like, well, I have more time. They gave me a long-term 3 weeks, let's say, because it's a standard thing. And you start building the bookmarks and the drill through, and you have all these little neat features and report tooltips. Well, that can make the report louder, where sometimes the short term is they need to know this at the very basic core. They just need to know this number. It takes all these steps and processes and all this background noise just to find out what is this number. And we just want to track this number. If they had a card, a dashboard, a scorecard that just showed number X, they will be satisfied. But then we can kind of build too much fluff on top of it, I think, when it deals with the long term, where in a sense, we don't necessarily know when to stop. And I think that's one of the other risks. And then part of that is bloat.
So one of the things I think through when you guys talk through this is, how do I know, based on a report request, when I'm jumping into a short-term solution versus a long-term solution? Where's that decision break point? So I guess as I'm thinking about this, like, okay, I hear what we're saying. We're all kind of saying slightly different things, right? Tom, you're saying like it's a simple report. It's not a lot of stuff going on it. We still have maybe themes, and I'm finding it like bend on like how I perceive a short-term report. But on the other end of this, I mean, I really go back to Matthew Roth's Roach's pyramid on, at the top of that pyramid is the governed data sources. There's a smaller subset of governed data sources, and I keep feeling like these short-term solutions are more of this self-service space a little bit that is a little bit more organic on how they're being created and what they're doing. And then at the top of this apex of the pyramid, where we start talking about, enterprise data warehousing, we have a lot of rigor around the data set. To me, those are longer-term solutions, and there are, I was writing down notes here. In that long-term solution, we're clearly saying there needs to be an SLA with the data. We have probably help tips across the report. We're probably also adding potential training videos about the report.
Mhm.
And that speaks to like that larger audience. We're going to consume this report at the larger audience level. Where I think this conversation bodes well for organizations is to, as a report developer, when do I know a random request has come to me? When do I know it's either short-term or long-term? Or how can I identify that as a user?
So, and I love what you're saying. I also find it very interesting that just the definition of short-term and long-term, we all have, in a sense, slightly different definitions, which I find very interesting. And I bet if you ask the people listening and watching, it's all going to be a slightly variation, which I think would affect your behavior.
I think so, reading through the chat here from YouTube, YouTube's been quite active, and we got a number of people kind of chit-chatty back and forth. It sounds like a lot of these are like talking about like adding incremental value, right? I build a report, I want to add incremental value and keep building that report, acknowledging that along that route there's going to be some level of tech debt, but we're going to defer that for later, right? So short-term allows for more technical debt in a report build. A long-term solution is you're trying to weed out as much tech debt as possible within a reasonable amount of time. And I think that's a very fair, like, again, we're not going to be able to like nail this down with a single idea, I don't think. I think this is going to be kind of a broad spectrum of what people are going to, but in general, right, I feel like that's the right direction.
I would agree with that, because kind of another angle in terms of identifying that short-term and long-term, I don't necessarily think the project itself, when it's presented to you, is always known it's going to be short or long-term.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
So when I say this is, so I'm going to contact my phrase here. When I say a report comes to you, right? Again, I'm thinking that this is report needs that are coming to me as like the BI team or the BI lead or whatever. The report requests are coming in. Maybe we have a Jira ticket system, or stuff just comes in and we're like, oh, okay. That's one perspective to look at this. Also, I think another perspective is just across the whole organization. People have Power BI desktop across the org. When do I walk in? Like, I walk into a room, people are working on a Power BI report, or they have something on the screen that's Power BI report based. Can I assess what we're looking at? I'm coming in, knowing nothing basically. I show up and be like, oh, well, this is a short-term solution, and then we know what we have expectations now. Or if I walk into a room and like, oh wow, okay, this is a long-term solution. I think just being able to have, I guess the question here is there a way to identify when I walk into that room or a request is given to me in either of those scenarios, what's short-term and long-term? Because I think that if you can communicate to your team, hey, what you just asked me to is like, and this is I do with clients, I do t-shirt sizing, right? They're like, oh, I want this cool, amazing thing, like just like this other program. I'm like, okay, well, that's a large T-shirt. Like you ask for something that's hard to do. That's a lot of effort, because we're playing within this Power BI framework. We have certain things that are easy and certain things that are more effort to build. And then I can give them like, okay, well, if you don't want that, here's other alternative solutions that would be easier to implement and it would take less time. So I'm helping them understand like what is the scope of what the framework can do or not do when they ask me these requests. So I think when I'm coming into these situations, I'm looking at going, okay, short-term, long-term, what t-shirt sizes are we looking at? Just kind of generally, like, is it large or is it a small?
Well, and what you just said is exactly what I'm saying, where you may have this big request is long-term, but based on other things going on, it's like, okay, if we made this short-term, what would it look like?
Yeah.
Would that be satisfactory?
Yep.
Take the data governance, getting that rolled out. That's obviously a long-term solution. You're not getting that rolled out in 3 days. However, and especially based on Melissa Coates' writing and the documentation, what does that short term look like to get it at least off the ground?
Yeah.
Like, what is a minimum valuable product for governance? And I think that it can go both ways. But what you just said is exactly what I was referring to, is where the request may not necessarily present itself as short term, but you may need to make a compromise or pivot to say, okay, we need to make this short term.
Yes, I agree. And I think that's a conversation that you need to at least be in the back of your mind is just kind of like someone saying, Dan Meisner, is the t-shirt made of heavy cotton, Egyptian cotton, or is it more like a t-shirt I pick up from Walmart, thin and light? That's true. I mean, am I making a wool coat or am I making a t-shirt actually? So,
Right.
I think the challenge with that though is, and I like your idea, right? Like even if you're going into any meeting, like t-shirt sizing for
Right.
people, right? You can't always do that like with visual representation, right? Because sometimes the hardest part about building, a report page is the calculations that we have to,
Right.
like create and massage to get the experience the way the end user wants it, right? So it's not
Yep.
it's not necessarily the pretty it's the
Right.
challenge of like what are they asking, and like introducing what I've been mulling around in my head, which is like how do you convey to the business that like what we're doing is more than your manual Excel function or the simple SQL query, right? And I think there's this huge misconception that needs to be addressed in this conversation, that Power BI solutions are in some way, we talk about framework, but in some respects, like they're an application. They're a data application. Like the amount of development, hardcore development that goes into, building pipelines and transforming data and cleaning data and then building calculations on top of things. Like, I think by nature, we've done ourselves almost a disservice by talking about how simple Power BI is. And it can be, it's fantastic. A business user can go slap some things together and get great insights. But when we're talking about like complex reports or deep insights that are being driven, in some high level business reports that are being used by everybody, like this, this is heavy development work. And it's interesting to me that it should be more part of the conversation in some way, that in the same way that the business looks at IT and the developers like, oh man, well they could say it takes a month and I'd be okay with that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas with us, it I'm just trying to introduce like that thought in there, because it's not always the look. It's
Well,
not always.
and I think you're absolutely right about that.
When you were mentioning that, Seth, I feel like let me play a scenario, and you guys tell me if I'm off base or not. I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about these short-term solutions, a short-term solution has a defined end time. It has a defined life cycle. I'm only going to use it for this small audience, and I am kind of anticipating it to be.
I thought we walked away from that.
Well, I thought
definition. Yeah.
Well, maybe. Well, so here, let me. This is the business scenario I'm thinking through, right? I've been in situations where someone has come to me and says, "Hey, I have a Power BI report. It's working for me. We're looking to make this. We need to add more data to it. We need, again, these additional requirements are coming. That is taking this short-term report and moving it into more of like a longer-term solution." So the person who built it initially was just saying, "I'm just going to play around with something. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to figure out what the." And this is what we talk about, Seth, all the time. Right? Act like the business, think like IT. Right? We want that short, quick version of a report just to prove out is the report even going to be worth our time, right? Do that short term look at that report, get something together, and if people are finding value from the data that's in the report, now we can step back and say, okay, let's assess some more of these longer term objectives, and that report changes from that short term solution that someone kind of built on their own in a vacuum. We start adding these other things that are going to make it more of a long-term viable solution. So I feel like I have had a lot of conversations like that, right? Here's my report. It's not great. The M code is a mess. We're doing way more M than we should. And now we're going back and saying, okay, most of this M should get pushed back into SQL or the back end. And you go through the report and say, I know what you built. And now I'm putting those SLAs around this report. Again, this is one of the things we talked about makes it long-term. Push those things back up into the back end. And then now we've got this more robust pattern to follow. Does that make sense? Like,
I think yes, I think it absolutely is part of the conversation. We just deviated slightly from a BI team building a report.
Yeah.
No, and it's fine. But you address the same types of things in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
Which I think potentially bring different challenges, right?
Agreed.
Because if we're in the BI realm, like I know what I'm sacrificing versus like what you're talking about, which I love, is that the adoption methodology of like,
Yes.
I'm a self-service user. I built this wonderful usage of mishmash of spider web of things.
Yep.
Here, I want to graduate this because the value to the business is increasing.
Yes.
What do you do with that? Like,
Yes.
to me, that's to me, that's short term.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So yeah,
because you're gonna have to still go through those same things of like, okay, great, what did you build? And then like figure out what the minimum viable product or that short term solution is going to be, because now it's in the realm of like, I think your thought pattern of increasing value to the business while graduating things up the steps of
and I think we've always been talking the extremes. We're either talking like, give me a table or give me the most advanced DAX functions you've ever seen with the most advanced report. I think there's this whole other kind of middle ground where you can have a long-term overall solution that may have some short-term fixes in it. And I'm not talking technical debt. And what I'm referring to here is basically, have you ever had a report in report development purgatory where it's like you keep doing these iterations and it has basically what the initial request was, but it's basically, oh, well, you know what would be great? Can we add this? And then you keep doing these additional things that maybe could be done once it's published, where you can add that other page. Like, hey, you know, actually, can you add a gap analysis to this? Or that would be great. But it already has in a sense, the framework. It has to build the themes that it can be published and begin to be used. And I think that's where sometimes the fear of saying, let's get this long term where we're getting everything that the stakeholder wants, where you can say, okay, we've built based to the request, we have satisfied the needs, they like it, they want to add now all these additional bells and whistles. Where can we in a sense say, is it at a point right now where we can revisit those, but let's get this pushed out?
Yeah, I'm oh man, so many good thoughts. So I feel like so we were talking earlier. We were kind of arguing about like, does it have to have a theme in a background or not? I mean, I think
yes.
I think
just to reiterate that.
I think to your point though, right? I mean, again, I think I'm changing my tune here a bit, right? If you have templates, right? If you have some good planning around this, a center of excellence that's pumping out, here's a couple templates to start from. Here's where you begin, and you know, also now thinking about what Seth and I built around with scrims and layouts, right? A scrim basically is here's a collection of background images that let you see how these visuals should potentially be oriented on a page. It doesn't lock you into a specific one design. It just gives you some planning around all of that. So having off the shelf things like that initially, I think reduces some of the risks at the short term. So Tommy, one of your comments here was like, can we, talking through like what are the risks of doing one or either of these approaches, right? I think one of the risks of short term is you have the potential for like not conforming to like a company standard or something like, and that's where I think that, as a solution to that risk is think about templates that you can publish out into your center of excellence that people can just go pick up and say, hey, when you're starting reports, start from here. This will automatically get you into a place where you're kind of ready to go, kind of thing.
I'm gonna shift gears here based on this conversation a little bit. To me, right, if short versus long is addressing different problems at different times.
Ooh.
And I think maybe that's where going into those initial conversations is important, right? Because what is a short term? What is the value of a short term thing? In a short period of time, you're able to address a business problem with the results of the report.
Yep.
Right.
Agreed.
So you're solving that immediate need. Does the business at that time care about, performance innately, right? Do they care about how it's going to scale to 100,000 users? I mean, that's absurd, but 1,000 users instead of the 10. No,
yeah. Yep.
They don't. I think what happens over time is in the moment where we're building stuff, are we providing the value to the business without sacrificing the ability to address those future problems, right? Like, are you building something that is just throwaway? Well, you better make sure it doesn't get picked up, for long-term usage. And I think because
or at least call out there's a lot of tech debt that goes along with getting it out of short term.
But think about what tech debt is, right? think about what tech debt is, and this is why I'm saying like those 5 areas are the 5 areas I choose to skimp on. I'm not harming the report, but I don't
Mhm.
know where it's going to scale.
Correct.
If all of a sudden the report starts to slow down for business users, the business is going to find value in you performance tuning. That was a tech debt thing we chose to do.
Yes.
Mhm.
If the report is all of a sudden exploding in the organization and people don't know how to use it well, maybe we invest more time in enhancing the usage and the visually appealing aspects of it because you're solving that business problem. But I think what's important is when you're building things, you're picking and choosing the right things that you could invest more time in,
Mhm.
or it supports the ability to invest more time in versus complete throwaway work, where in order to address what those potential problems could be, you're not starting from scratch.
No, and I love that because like I completely agree with you if I believe I heard you correctly, where you may have a long-term project, a long-term solution for a report, but within it, there may be certain short-term things that you're doing because it has the basic functionality. It has the data is accurate, but there are other things you could do within it that could be more long-term, but you may choose not to because at the time it is a valuable product that you can release. Is that kind of what you're referring to? Where you may have it could be a long-term project, but with short-term solutions within it.
I'm saying yes, that is what I'm saying. But at this, if we think about a theme we
Mhm.
consistently talk about, what's important for people to understand the architecture and
Yeah.
ecosystem building reports is it's important that you're always building for someone else
Mhm.
or for something else, right? So maybe my recommendation is regardless of short or long term, you shouldn't be building a short term solution for people, right? For yourself is different, for people that would require a total rewrite
Yes.
if
Yeah.
it turned into a long term thing. And there are decision points you can make, or as you're building out the report and finish, like put down those technical documentation tech debt parts that are like, hey, I made this decision. If performance comes up, like this is the thing we fix. If there's no visual interactions in this report, we could add info buttons and
Right.
here's the calculation to things. We just didn't have time to do it because we didn't have two days to build in bookmarks, right? Like the placeholder for coming back and resolving some of those things that would become long term.
Yeah, so there's basically bare minimum requirements regardless of
Right.
what you're doing.
Right.
You should never have reports like just don't click refresh. So
No,
yeah.
it's where you make a refresh button in Paint and put it up on the right hand side.
Oh, that's funny. So I'm gonna try and boil this down to some. I've heard a lot of things we've talked about. I'm taking literally feverish notes around all these things. This is just really good stuff, I feel like. So if I had to go look at like short term, long term, it sounds like I'm gonna throw out some generalized buckets here of where we're doing these compromises. So it sounds like what we're saying, short term, there are some compromises that are not in what we're doing in long term. And the reason being is because we want the development time to be shorter versus a multi-month or a longer running development process on a report. So short term, we're talking about 3 kind of areas: performance, documentation, and I'm just going to call a very generic one, rigor around UI UX. Those are the 3 areas of a report. In short term, testing, performance, maybe we're not tuning in as much as we should, right? But in a long-term solution, we're talking about SLAs. We're talking about tuning and performance and making sure that we have a test bed of 1,000 users to hit this report data model and making sure that it's performant, right? We're looking at things like that. We're doing incremental refresh. The data is getting larger, right? Size of volume. Those are kind of things that are more long-term solution supporting. Documentation, right? In the short term, maybe we're not documenting everything. And you said it earlier, Seth. You was like, the report might be growing in usage, but we don't have a lot of help bubbles around the page. We don't have instructional videos. There's not a training session that people went through to go to the video to the report. So we're cutting some corners. We're doing less documentation in order to get it out in a short-term solution. And then the final is around like the rigor around the UI UX, right? Walking the user journey through the report, making sure the buttons make sense, adding bookmarks, more styling around the background images and scrims and stuff like that, right? So, I mean, would you guys agree? Is that like would you quantify most of the things we're talking about as fitting in one of those 3 areas?
I do. I'm also going to throw in like one of the first steps, which is probably in that upfront conversation, right, with business. And we add it, but maybe this is where, what is the business value of the report? Like, what is the most important thing that we solve when we build this report? And it's probably going to be like, we don't have visibility into the data. Like, I don't know. We're trying to answer this business problem. And maybe the next follow-up question to that is, okay, let's say this report lives for 3 to 6 months, or the audience grows. Are the same value props there, or what enhancements would you like to see in the report, or what would be important for you to have as a business user? That and obviously functionality at working, things like that are going to be there, but it would also potentially draw up, oh, well, eventually my pipe dream would be that I have 20 bookmarks on the right hand side and I can navigate to any report in the system and blah, blah, like you never know where that stuff is going to lead.
Cross report drill through.
So
Yeah.
are you adding another category, or are you adding something like, so to me,
I think this is the step before.
I think it's a step before.
I think this is part of documentation though.
No,
I'm
I think
saying
this is
initial
part of the
business
scoping.
conversation, scoping.
Yeah, because I completely agree with Seth, where you have that conversation where you're finding out, even with the long term, where it's like, hey, what is the minimum viable thing just to get this driving? Then we can worry about air conditioning.
But it also clarifies, and I
right.
think this is the important thing.
Yeah,
It
that's what I was
clarifies
gonna say.
in your head what are the
Focus
things you
on the
could
core.
skip out on.
Right. And I think that's actually a great. I was literally just
hold on. Scoping does not relate to those 3 items though. Scoping is just defining what's in those 3 items. Scoping is a separate conversation altogether. Regardless if you're doing long-term or short-term reporting, there should always be a scoping conversation. Scoping is not part of what the long-term or short-term solution is.
I'm saying these questions would certainly help you understand.
Oh, totally agree.
What the short-term value of what you're building is, and introducing a concept to that end user of, say, we know the audience is 10 people right now, but do you see this expanding within the organization? Is this something that you would find value as it would increase? Yes. Okay. Does our current solution meet all of those needs, or what does this look like in 6 months to a year or whatever? That's what I'm driving at, because then you're bringing or introducing some of these ideas or thoughts of how you would go build it.
But I'm saying that's part of scoping. But what I'm saying though is scoping is a part of both long-term and short-term. Before you do either one of those things, there's always I'm talking when I was talking my 3 points there, I still think the only 3 points for talking about where we're making the compromises come from performance, documentation, and rigor on UI and UX. Those are the only 3 areas.
Well, I think there's 2 lanes right now that I think that's why there's this little disconnect right now. There's the short term for the tech side of the build, the actual, in a sense, IT side of your skill set. And I think there's a short term, long term of the business needs and the values, where there may be short term where you don't have all 10 measures in there or all 10 features in there, not necessarily that they have the right theme, but what the business needs. They may, to get out the door to provide the solution, may only need a subset of that. And I think that's what Seth was talking about, is what is the minimum valuable solution that's going to deliver value to you, impact. There's other things that they obviously may want, but I think there's more of a core. Like if we just could see our sales, connected to the first purchase a customer ever made. And if we could just see that, we would be more than happy. And that would help a lot. They obviously requested for, 30% more, but there's a core that they wanted. I think they're disconnected. There's that tech build that you're referring to, Mike. And I think there's a short-term, long-term on the actual project itself. And I don't think they're necessarily completely dependent on one another.
I mean, I don't see why this is different though. So I still think all you guys are saying right now is you're just talking scoping. You're asking questions about the end users and saying, hey, help me understand the nature of what this report is doing. I still think the only 3 buckets you're going to be compromising on are those 3 items. You're going to be picking and choosing how in depth you want to go for each one of those, whether it's a short term or long term.
Well, let me phrase it to you this way. No matter what report you work on, you're going to have to worry about the 3 things you talked about.
That's what I'm
right?
saying. That's what I'm
Regardless.
saying. Yeah,
Yeah, regardless.
it's happening on every report regardless. And so you're saying,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
you're saying, hey, I'm not going to put a bunch of help icons all over the report page because
Right.
it takes too much time. That's not part of our long-term solution. But I think what you guys are saying, which is very relevant, is these are the kind of questions we're talking about for an MVP, for the first run of whatever we're talking about for this report. Tell me what we think we need to know so we can decide what t-shirt size that we're talking about here. Because
Mhm.
things like you were saying, Seth, earlier, like who will this report be shared with? What's the expected audience? Is this one report part of a larger collection of reports? I don't know, right? And so those questions up front are helping us automatically gauge these three areas, saying if we're not fitting these kind of criteria, and I'm going back to the training I did with Melissa Coates. A lot of the stuff that she does and helping you talk about this is she takes you from a short-term type build solution on a report, and you think about what that looks like, and then you think about what are the hurdles, what are the steps or the stair steps that we need to make in order to make this report a governed and larger report shared more broadly across the organization, right?
So I think these are two different topics. Like
Mhm.
I get the
I
graduation,
disagree.
right? You can disagree all you want. The fact of the matter is that graduation is you're taking an end user report and putting it into a realm which we're talking about. We're talking about
Yep.
this realm, right? And if we're consolidating the conversation, right? I do think that in all of our upfront questions, we haven't had something like Johnny brings up in the chat, which is maybe this is consolidated in the what must be there right now, right? What should we have? What could you have? And what would you like to have? And if like take those four questions, it's very similar to what I'm saying, is because if you know where the business wants to go or would love to go with the report, you know what areas you wouldn't want to skimp out on in the short term, or you would want to make sure that as the business intelligence person, you're the one that is uh, making sure that the report will scale in those areas. And it could be the same three areas that we're talking about, but you have I'm looking at this from yes, we have a wealth of experience to come from, and we're making decisions all the time to make sure our report scales in any way.
Yep.
Right.
But
Regardless of
not everybody has all that experience. So it's like, hey, maybe these qualifying scope questions are super valuable to help you understand oh,
where to
I'm not going
focus.
to not do this thing or set this up in such a way that I could get to these next levels if the report exploded, and all of a sudden the business is going to come back and say, hey, that should have, it's a need right now.
Yeah. And I'm not disagreeing with any of the thoughts you have. Again, I agree. All the things you're asking for, you're talking about scoping. I think these are all things that happen before you can identify whether or not a report is short-term or long-term. All the things you described to me.
It certainly helps
I-
in the
Well,
decision.
I think the
process.
scoping dictates whether or not
That's what I'm
you're going to
saying.
be short term. So, but the
Right.
three things you said, what the three things you said, the
Okay, so,
performance, the
yeah,
visual,
performance,
yeah,
documentation, and UI
it doesn't
UX.
matter if you're doing a short term. You should be focusing on getting those right, regardless. Making sure that your titles are right. That's not necessarily if you build. If
Not
you
disagreeing there, but there's a
Right.
there's a level of rigor that is increasing as you go to a long-term solution, and that's all I'm saying. I'm saying there are three buckets. You will, regardless whether it's short-term or long-term, you will always be addressing performance, documentation, and UI UX. Those are the three areas
Sure.
that I see
Yeah.
that will always be happening in every report.
Think of this in a matrix. Those are the three columns,
Yep.
and then I have four other questions of what do you need right now?
Right.
MVP, short term. What do you want next?
Right.
What do you want after that? What do you want after that? The graduation of how you go down in that matrix is exactly what we're talking about.
Yep.
And if I can understand what those levels are,
The
I'm
output of
gonna
that
understand
is short-term or
understand-
long-term.
Right.
Correct,
Yeah,
right.
no, agreed.
Yeah.
We're saying the same thing. I think we're just saying it differently.
Okay.
So I'm just saying, I'm trying to, literally, I'm writing up the blog now of here's the kind of what
I can't wait to read this.
what should we be doing, right? We should be having this scoping kind of conversation, and what kind of questions are we asking during scoping that's helping us define these three key areas, and then based on the scoping information, we're then saying, okay, the UIX is going to be at a 1. Documentation is going to be at a 3. Testing and performance we need that to be a 5, right? And then you can kind of say, okay, based on this information we've been given prior to this, we know where this would fit. And we could say most reports are going to fit in 1s and 2s to say short term. If it's a 5 on any of these categories, it's now long-term solution.
This is a blog right out of this conversation.
That's
right?
what I'm going. I've been saying yes.
In that matrix though, that makes that conversation even easier.
Yes.
Right. Because then you're forcing the business user to
Bingo.
prioritize what they want. And each of those, gradations, you're saying takes a longer period of time.
I'm giving you like the dynamic T-shirt sizing.
Yes. 100%.
Talk to me about what you want.
We're solving the long-term conversation right now.
Yes. Actually, I think I a little breakthrough here too. And I think with that, must have, should have, could have.
I like that a lot.
Of time. Well, because a lot of times I think people come to you with everything, and you think, okay, I have to do everything. But I think you could scrape off a lot of the fat and still have this long-term solution where if you kind of identify, okay, what is the must-have? And then you can focus there, build something. And also that's going to add to Seth's point. That's going to really dictate where you're spending your time on your visuals, where you're spending your time on your focus. And if you get that right, then maybe the should have, you can be built on it, but the could have maybe can be another cycle because that's not necessarily a requirement, but usually we just say, hey, what do you want? And they will just run through a bulleted list. And it's not indexed or ordinal at all.
Yep.
But that fourth column, Mike, is time to implement.
Yeah.
And then you have your estimates.
And then that's where you can and this goes back to where we were saying where you can say, okay, they would go through all the must have and should have. Okay, well, based on what you said for item X on should have, this is going to take a while. So can we pivot here?
And I think
and have that discussion with them.
Stuff where this makes a lot of sense to me is we start talking about like there's a couple things here too. Like when I'm talking about someone asks for a visual, like, hey, I found this visual on the internet. It looks kind of like this. Can you produce this in Power BI? The answer is yes, typically, but it's usually like I got to go use Charticulator to go build it, or I got to go build a custom visual to go build it. Because once we get to custom visuals, anything's possible. You can build basically anything you want. There are a couple limitations, but like you get a lot more flexibility when we get to this full custom spectrum. And again, what I'm thinking through this, and like one of the UI UX properties here is anything that's short term should not have any custom visuals. I probably shouldn't even go to the app store and go digging around for custom visuals because it's going to take too long. Everything in short term. So this is where I'm saying, like, I think you can, once you kind of identify these 3 buckets, now you can start saying, okay, these types of acknowledgments on the input of this, whether it be custom visuals, not custom visual, whatever it is, from those areas, we can now say, okay, I can now clearly see that based on this 2 or 3 request item, this is going to be a longer term solution, and this is a bigger T-shirt size. This is a more this is a 3-week, 5-week effort based on what you asked for, and then you can negotiate with them. And this is the best part, I think, is like they're like, well, 5 weeks is too long. I'm like, well, fine, we've got to cut out this, and this. If we chop that, now we can make it into a short-term report. But now, this is so good because once you had the conversation, you've documented it, you've pulled those things out. That now becomes part of your tech debt. So now you can then log it away and say, if you want these other things to happen, this is the extra effort required to make that thing better quality or bring it upstream.
It may not be like I would distinct like enhancement is different than a tech debt thing for me. Like you're still going to be making some choices in here with implementation that you might need to tweak.
But at least you've documented them now, though.
Because tech debt is usually something you don't talk to business about.
Yeah,
right.
We usually kind of hide that on the
Well, it's a backlog. It's called a backlog. That business backlog.
Yeah. Right.
We'll add it to the backlog, aka tech debt.
So I will say, this idea here, especially about kind of prioritizing, itemizing these functionalities, so to speak, one of the best things that really helped me was building solutions in the Power Platform, not just the reporting. So Microsoft has an amazing document about planning a Power App. And it's like the whole project planning for that, like the scoping, the discoverability, because that is a very different conversation. It's similar, but a very different conversation because that's requiring user interaction or input. So, and there's a lot more dependencies, but that's helped me build or scope out reports because there's a lot of items where they're like, we want all this in this application and input here. And you're like, okay, if we were to do this, it's going to, take much longer for us to get to where we want to go. But the basic thing that we wanted to do was you could input to this form and it will automate here. Can can we publish this and get this at least being used now? And again, then you have all those other things that are those, like, it would be nice to have if, it could create a ticket in Jira or, update someone in Slack. Well, based on the configuration, that's going to take additional additional time. So if you want, like I said, if you want to really see this in practice, or a requirement, because it will happen, is build a Power App for somebody, and this will exactly happen. But everything we're saying, I absolutely love, and I think is spot on in terms of, I think, also helping a report developer focus on the right things, and also aligning I think at the end of the day, it's setting and aligning expectations with your stakeholder. So you can go out of that scope and call, and you're both exactly on the same page on what's going to be done.
Dan Meisner says, you need to talk about QFDs, quality functional development. I think it's an interesting phrase there. I'm going to go Google that one a little bit more. It helps you get scope, tech requirements, and it helps you provide longer term. So, I mean, I think Dan just coined it, right? Now all of our conversations are like, all right, hello, welcome to reporting.
Got a blog title.
We're gonna look for the QFD, or let's talk our QFDs for this reporting now, and we've coined it. I don't know if this is a real phrase. It's like, it could be already out in the internet.
Yeah, I hope it's on Wikipedia.
We're actually probably just finding our way into well-established thoughts and ideas that are already out there.
I think that's what the T-shirt says now.
We should make this process called.
This is why we call it the water cooler talk, not the.
We know everything talk.
Welcome to the Quality Functional Development Podcast, hosted by Tom.
I love it. Well, this is probably a good time to cut it. Everyone, thank you very much for the conversation. This was really good. This is probably one of the more heated conversations we've had around figuring things out and refining the idea. Honestly, though, I think we came down to a really good place. We'll see if I have time to materialize these ideas into kind of like an actual like blog that kind of maybe describes a bit more of what this thinking is, and get more feedback and comments from the community. What are they finding? What's working for them? So our only ask for people who are listening to the podcast, if you like what you heard here, if you learned something new, please just go share it with one other person. Let them know that you are finding value from it. And we're live more often than not, hopefully. Then, and if you're watching or listening or watching, Tommy, where can you find the podcast?
You can find the podcast anywhere they're available. If you're watching live, you can subscribe on Apple and Spotify to always get new episodes. If you want to join the conversation, if you're listening on audio, follow Power BI Tips on YouTube and LinkedIn. We publish the videos in advance, so you can always see what's coming up and make sure that you get notified.
Thank you all very much for listening or watching. We'll see you next time.